Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Cushwa Center and the University of Notre Dame, I'm very pleased to welcome you formally to our international conference, Global History and Catholicism. My name is Kathleen Straus Cummings. I direct the Cushwa Center, and I'm a faculty member in the departments of History and American Studies here at Notre Dame. I am always delighted to welcome back to campus so many of Cushwa Center regulars, but it's also a particular pleasure to welcome many of you who are first-time visitors to campus or attending a Cushwa event for the first time. And I think that in looking over the list and looking at all the faces, I think there are more of those first-time visitors than typical, and that was indeed part of our vision for this conference. We wanted to extend the reach. We are the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, but as those of you who have been following us know, we've been expanding it beyond US borders and trying to think about what it means to have a church that is universal and how that affects what we study here at the Cushwa Center. So it's just so exciting. We've been seeing all your names now for almost a year, and to be able to connect those names with faces. You're warmly welcomed here, and if I haven't met you yet, I surely will in the next couple of days. I think the conference is off to a great start. The only complaint I've heard is that people are having a hard time choosing among so many excellent competing sessions. And we are sorry about that. We couldn't have an 8-day conference and give everyone slot the sessions. We had to do it concurrently. But I will say that what we're known for at the Cushwa Center is the ability to bring people together and start conversations. And we really see this as a beginning, and we hope that you'll connect with other scholars, and we hope to build a network, and we already can see that emerging from this conference. As you can imagine, planning a conference of this magnitude entails a lot of detail-oriented work, a lot of logistics, and so I want to thank Madonna Noak, who's back there, for all she's done. And also Shane Ulbrich, who is the Assistant Director of the Cushwa Center. He may have just stepped out, but let's give him a round of applause. Oh, Shane, there you are. I'd also like to thank Pete Chaika, a postdoctoral fellow at the Cushwa Center. I see him there, and I know many of you have been corresponding with Pete. I'd also like to thank, too, when we envisioned this conference, we brought together a planning group that came to campus in February of 2018 for a really exhilarating session, which we gave them a massive amount of reading to do ahead of time, and to help us think through what the major themes would be of this conference. So I'd just like to recognize those participants, most of whom are here with us today. Juliana Camedes, University of Wisconsin-Madison, James Chappell from Duke University, Valentina Ciciriot, Ca' Foscari, University of Venice, Susanna Distratus, University of Notre Dame, Elizabeth Foster, Tufts University, Udi Greenberg, Dartmouth College, Piotr Kosicki, University of Maryland, Charles Mercier, University of Bordeaux, Florian Michel, University of Paris-Sorbonne, my colleagues at Notre Dame, Jaime Pensado and Sarah Shordell, and Albert Wu, University of Paris. So can we give a round of applause to all of those members of the planning committee? We also want to acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors of this conference from around Notre Dame, the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, the College of Arts and Letters Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts, Latin American, North American Church Concerns at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, and Notre Dame's Office of Research. This conference truly has been a collaborative effort, and I'd particularly like to thank my co-convener, John McGreevy, the Francis A. McEnany Professor of History here at Notre Dame. John, as many of you know, served as our dean for many years. In fact, the last several times I introduced him, I had to introduce him as my boss, but I guess I don't have to do that right now. You're just, as you know, John is a brilliant scholar of Catholicism who focused on the American experience, but increasingly is looking for a global perspective. So he was a major part of the vision for this conference, and it was such a delight to work with him in planning it. At this point, I'm going to hand things over to John to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Let me join Kathy in welcoming everyone to this conference. We think it'll be a superb occasion, and we do thank you for joining us. When we began the planning process, Kathy, as director of the Cushwa Center, myself, and the wonderful members of our steering committee agreed upon the conference's primary goal: connecting the surge of recent, superb work on modern Catholicism in all areas of the world to important disciplinary conversations about global history. So this was our challenge. Who could we get to do a keynote address to help us frame that important conversation? Who was not working in the relatively small but superb and vibrant pool of historians interested in modern Catholicism, but who could still help us think about integrating that subfield into larger narratives? It had to be someone who thought about global history. In fact, it would be ideal if we could get one of the authors of the most sophisticated textbook in the field. It would be great if that person also ran a global history workshop at his or her university. It should also be someone with institutional savvy, maybe a scholar who's taken on leadership roles, such as department chair or program director. It really had to be a distinguished scholar, someone who's won fellowships from the ACLS and the Guggenheim, someone whose publications include influential monographs such as Republic of Capital, Buenos Aires and the Legal Transformation of the Atlantic World, 1999, someone who has written some of the most important books and articles on the age of democratic revolutions, notably an American Historical Review piece that squarely placed slavery and the slave trade in that democratic age of revolution, and a widely cited 2006 study, Sovereignty and Revolution in the Iberian Atlantic. And just to give a plug, those are available at the bookstore outside there. It should be someone able to think about intellectual life more broadly. It would be amazing if we could find someone who has written an award-winning, and I will say, genuinely beautiful biography of the unclassifiable social scientist Albert Hirschman. Someone who understands how Hirschman's deeply historical work about path dependency and the origins of modern politics should actually push and inspire all of us as historians to ask and answer big questions. Wouldn't it be perfect if this person was even now completing a book for Princeton University Press entitled Latin America, A Global History? I think you know where this is going. Please join me in welcoming someone we just had to invite, someone who is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of History and Director of the Global History Lab at Princeton University, and someone who will now speak on the topic, Catholicism and Globalization, Coincidence or Causation. That someone is, of course, Jeremy Adelman.
Well, that's hard to follow up on, I'm afraid. But I want to thank to John and Kathy, all the organizers and hosts here at Notre Dame. It really is an honor to be invited. As you no doubt know, I am neither a historian of a Catholic life. I'm not even American. I'm Canadian. I work on Latin America and other topics. But one of the great pleasures of being invited was to get a small package, or rather a small box, a large package of books by some of you, including John, which gave me a sense of the range and excitement of the field. Now, it's an honor to be invited. I know I'm also the person, so I looked at the program, that stands between what's already been a long day and a long glass of wine. And I feel a little bit like some of the missionaries that I'm going to talk about shortly as an interloper in somebody else's tribe. But I do work on global history, and since global history is rather broad, that may not mean very much. So in another defense, I am a partial descendant of missionaries. They're going to loom large in the presentations after. This is my grandfather. And in fact, I'm working on a side project about how missionaries created narratives of global encounters on an everyday basis, which is something I'm going to come to at the end of the presentation here. But we often overlook the less famous figures like this one. This is taken in 1929, not long before my mother was born. We've also not thought so much about the less famous artifacts that they produce, like posters, memoirs, photographs. So these are some of the photographs that my grandfather took. On his way to China, he picked up a Leica in Hong Kong and became a very avid photographer. Let's see if just so you know who you're looking at, that's my grandmother. Teaching people in her parish how to read the Bible. And these are my grandfather had a secular eye as well. That's my grandmother being pushed around. I believe my mother is inside her in that photograph. But these photographs, images, everyday images, the posters that were used, these slideshows, in fact, were used to raise funds for the China mission. And since I'm also working on a history of Latin America since 1492, I'm going to share some thoughts drawn from the second chapter of that book. And it's at the juncture of those two projects that this evening I'll try to make an argument for something that we might call the Catholic world system. There are three components of this world system that I want to talk about. One is its polycentricity, that is, that it's a world system with multiple points and hubs held together by a decentralized knowledge circulation arrangement. Secondly, that it's composite, that it is a multi-scalar knowledge regime that functions from parish all the way up to central authorities, so that the global composite looked a lot like the composite monarchies and their apostles. Indeed, it helped explain, legitimate, mediate the Iberian monarchies on a global scale. And finally, that the work of the imagination combined theological and scientific, metaphysical and skeptical dimensions, and that we have to understand, therefore, the apostolic nature of the universal vision. It's already come up in Kathy's comments, a kind of universal vision. So to challenge, or rather raise some questions about the switch that global history flicks on when it wants to talk about globalization and modernity, as if it's ushered in by the modern age. And in fact, the case I want to make here is that this vision of an integrated universal did not have to wait for the universalisms of the Enlightenment. And in fact, there are certain durabilities and important legacies of these earlier models. The coinage Catholic world system, of course, is ripped from Emanuel Wallerstein's A European World System. And if the implications aren't yet clear, I'll spell them out. One is that this is not a Euro-centered world, and this is important for us to think about globalization now. Secondly, that it is pluralistic and not replicative. And third, that integration should not be reduced to its material determinants. Well, these were all very strong for Wallerstein's model. So this allows us to think about the importance of Catholicism and the Church in the conquest of the imaginary. That was at the heart of what Fernand Braudel called the fragility of this first unity of the world. And since we live in a rather fragile world now, I want to go back in time and look at a time when globalization did not look as stable as its euphoric defenders did after 1989. And to say that globalization is not necessarily modern. This idea of a first unity was, in fact, not Braudel's invention at all. It emerged after 1492 as if a second Earth got merged with the known Earth. But it emerged amidst unsurpassed horror and devastation. Entire peoples were wiped from the face of the earth. Millions more would be forced to work on estates and mines. And as the mestizo historian, whom I come back to at the end, Elinga Garcilaso de la Vega noted, the mixing of Renaissance curiosity and colonial cruelty yielded a single human unit. The discovery and ruin of the New World meant that, and I'll use this unfortunate practice just to distinguish my voice from the protagonist, there is only one world, said El Inca. For those who still imagine that there are many worlds, he added, there is no answer to be given except that they can remain in their heretical persuasions until they are undeceived in hell, unquote. How might we think, then, about the relationship between the destruction of one world, right, the one that lived before 1492, and the expansion of the whole world? Well, the familiar storyline for Brodel is, of course, well, it's a story about Eurocentric integration. Let's make a case for a different one, and I'll argue that, first of all, the encounters and conquests and colonizations around the world, but especially in the Americas, created European empires, not the other way around. We need to get our causal sequence straight to avoid reproducing Eurocentrism, which is a core feature of the global turn. Secondly, this approach accents the ways in which this integration got understood through divinely inspired models of unity that did not stand in opposition to skeptical and constructivist views of human progress. So the epistemological rupture that was so important to the 20th century philosophy, which accents the role of secularism as a condition for the making of the modern world, needs to be challenged. These first two conditions then point to a third one, that the role of non-Europeans in the making of this imagined unity. We need to find pathways and strategies for the first unity that does not presume that Europeans were the monopolists in the world-making business. Taking this polycentric approach has implications for how we think about world-making and globalization now. It highlights the importance of non-European dynamics and the role of conquest in world-making. It calls attention to the role of Catholic monarchies in setting in motion a vital dialectic at the heart of early modern globalization. So that in 1581, when the Spanish and Portuguese monarchies fused to form the world's first global power, the Iberian and Catholic world system discharged a global scramble for power, markets, and moral legitimacy. This allows us to think about the relationship then between markets and morals. And since the concept of moral economy is making a bit of a comeback, this is where I think this exchange around the history of Catholicism and global history can offer us some ways to rethink the conditions, or the global conditions. Here I phrase it, of course, as a relationship between Catholicism and globalization. And it could be presented as a tension of our day. Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change makes this point. In the end, everything has been entrusted to our protection, and he's referring to a universal here, which insists that the current economic model is intrinsically menacing the earth, that the tension between morality and markets has been sown into debates, however, about capitalism since the debate about capitalism surfaced in the 18th century. It's crystallized, of course, in the controversy over slavery and humanitarianism that started with Eric Williams, reinvigorated by Thomas Haskell in the 1980s. But much of this debate focused on the Anglo-American world, and especially the history of what would eventually become called the Protestant ethic. And we can see this most recently in the work of David Hollinger's. But the question we might pose this evening is, if we widen the framework, think globally in scale, and place Catholic agents into the story, what would the market moral tension look like? And this has some consequences. In many ways, the Protestant actors associated with Anglo-American capitalism were following in trails marked out by Catholic predecessors, trying to fathom the meanings of dependency on Native Americans, Africans, and the recognition of Chinese civilization. In John's marvelous book, American Jesuits in the World, we can in fact see how 19th century Jesuits fostered parishes, schools, and civic associations across America as an alternative or competitive rival to Protestant awakenings. Though not, one might add, of course, in 19th century Latin America, which is where I have my intellectual home. In some ways, this lecture examines Catholic and especially Jesuit agents before this reinvention. In fact, to argue that they did not have to wait until the 19th century to make Catholicism more global. We can spotlight the ways in which Christian organizations, both the apostolic regime of the Catholic monarchs, united from 1580 to 1640, which is going to be the concentration here this evening, as well as holy networks like the Society of Jesus, created a new framework for imagining global unity that did not presume European centrality, and in fact created a world of holy experiments. So the Catholic world system was not necessarily a European one, and this was necessary precisely because European habits of extraction and plunder were so universally unwelcome and resisted. So this is a story in a few parts. I was going to talk about reflect on the state of global history and the importance of connected and entangled narratives, and simply to say that the church was very obviously an early connector of globalized subjects in connecting distant places from Mexico, Goa, and the Philippines, and Lima, which is what I'm going to talk about, fueled by competition, both between and among orders, and later between Christian polities, that would be entangled by the rivalries, so that in fact, travelers, pilgrims, spies, a spy is going to show up in the talk, and missionaries were fellow intermediaries along with the merchants that have often dominated the stage in the narratives of globalization. News and images of conquests and contacts intensified the intervisibility of these rivals. That is, that people on either side of the imperial divides regarded each other with greater facility and eagerness, because all of this coincides with a print revolution, fueled by proliferating printing presses, networks of spies, and merchants of curiosities and commodities. By spreading this circulating imagery globally, their brokers, not unlike my grandfather's photographs that would wind up in photograph albums, their brokers augmented their value and induced newcomers and increasing the complexity of the entanglements. Within half a century of the fall of Mexico, Spanish officials in Manila, which had been seized in 1571, were hatching plans already. Animated by images of Cortesian triumphs in Mexico, to conquer now and to convert China, known as La Empresa de China. If Cuba had been the staging grounds to Mexico, the Philippines, with the support of men, money, and material drawn from Mexico primarily, could be an even grander stage for a Spanish triumph over China. To realize that image, Francisco de Sande, the governor of the Philippines, called for an army of 5,000 soldiers to bring down the Ming dynasty. Conquering China would remove the biggest obstacle, argued the plotters, to the spread of God's world across infidel Asia. It would open the back door to the interiors of Asia, and from Beijing, Christians could then move west to Baghdad and thence to Jerusalem, and an opportunity to wage the final crusade to liberate the Holy Land under the banners of the Catholic monarchs. This was the dream. But this dream of global encirclement ended like so many others back then and now, wrecked by the local and global rivalries that they spawned. By the time Sande returned to Manila from Mexico, where he had gone to muster the resources for his cause, the city had been burned and pillaged by Chinese and Japanese pirates who had also been consuming news about distant developments, including the conquest of Mexico, and had dispatched advance parties on Manila to grab some of the riches flowing already from the New World. This is 1570s. The population was in revolt, and while some have argued that the opening of Manila was a crucial stage in the forming of a world system by connecting Mexican supply of bullion with Chinese demand, it also locked regional players of Asia into a global political scramble by creating networks of circulating images and legends. Contacts and conquests then laid down the multiple radials and circulars from different corners of imperial webwork to transmit impressions of events and narratives from one place to another. We should spend some time on the importance of information networks, what Barreto and Supanov have called, in the case of the Portuguese in India, an information order, well before Paris became the hub of Orientalism later in the 17th century. For there were many kinds of Catholic actors, missionaries, physicians, and merchants radiating out of Spain and Portugal to create a regional, what they called República Cristiana in Asia and America. But one staple of the information order was a global Catholic book market that connected Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Now, the majority of these books did not necessarily deal with matters of faith, although they were circulating through the networks that were Catholic, but about science, lifestyle, geography, and they were printed in many languages. To be sure, the mission in China was thin and precarious, with some 30 to 40 Jesuits operating, and this was hardly Facebook, right? In fact, Leon Brocky describes it as vivid patches of Baroque piety set in a vast and largely indifferent land. But it did have an outsized effect on what Europeans learned about Asia and the world, and vice versa. Indeed, the production and circulation of texts and images gave all sides a picture of the whole. A year after being allowed into Beijing, Matteo Ricci teamed up with the Mandarin Zhang Wentao, Li Jizao, and other illiterati to co-create this largest world map. There were, in fact, several earlier editions which fused European cartographic practices with Chinese information. Several prints got made immediately, and they were quickly circulated across China, Korea, and Japan, and then would eventually make their way to Mexico and to Lima. Ricci himself, possibly to magnify the effects of his mission, claimed that 2,000 copies were reprinted as loose leaf or in books. Ricci was unaware of the skill of early Chinese world maps, we have to concede now, but his projection, 5 feet high by 12 feet wide across a folding screen of 6 panels, placed China at the center and was the first pictographic image for Chinese viewers of America. As Catholic kingdoms became empires and the church became a spanning information network that connected up these modes and made them intervisible to each other, sovereigns were forced to resolve their definitions of power, not just over whom, but what. This propelled a search for knowledge about the world. Europeans were crossing borders of the New World and the Old, hunting for antiquities, preciosities, and naturalia to valorize exchanges, contacts, and conquests. Portraits of nature and charts of the seas contributed to the concern to understanding nature and its laws, to create an early form of imperial mise en valeur in far-flung places. Their seeds, their plants, texts, and drawings flowed through imperial networks, Catholic imperial networks, to create a sense of value from the world. Manuel Godinho de Heredia, a mixed Malay and Portuguese Malaccan, former Jesuit turned cartographer and artist, had taught math at the St. Paul Jesuit College in Goa and produced breathtaking color, this is the pineapple, breathtaking color aquarelle paintings of plants with accompanying notes about their pharmacological properties. Figures like Heredia made strange things more familiar, more commensurable, lacing together the global origins of a scientific revolution with a search for commercial value. This is why I'm challenging some of the ideas that there was some pre-scientific order that the Catholics had constructed that required a scientific and Protestant revolution to overturn. That this process of mingling began much earlier and didn't even presume that there had to be an overhaul. All of this, of course, augmented the stakes in and commitment to expansion. This flow of learning and discovery across the East-West divide accompanied warfare, espionage, and diplomacy, which we know much more about, and of course, not to mention trade, which is the staple of globalization narratives. Steeped in classical models, Italian humanists constructed an image of the Turks while borrowing from them. Scholars have described the accommodations and reciprocal flows of natural studies and mediating role of Jesuit scientists, especially after the arrival of Ricci to the Forbidden Palace. As global horizons opened up and monarchies fastened on territorial marking, the value of scientific discovery only intensified, and the exodus of botanists and surveyors exemplified the interest in producing valuable knowledge about and from the archipelago of islands and continental interiors. We should remind ourselves that Heredia was just one example of the dependence on local knowledge and local producers, what Gavin Bailey has called a cultural partnership between local suppliers and global diffusers of knowledge, fueled by the urge to convert and to cure. To describe this as imperial means then connecting localities and local agents. The result was a kind of high hybrid of the well-known codices of Mexico and the botanical atlases of India. Bailey has shown us the many ways in which St. Luke's Virgin got rendered as one of the most popular images that Jesuits would use worldwide, from Mexico to Ming China, with versions in the Philippines and Brazil. This one illustrated here is from the Field Museum, for those of you who are passing via Chicago, have a visit, was from one of the altarpieces of Ricci's mission. I don't know if you can see it that well from where you're sitting, but the long silk scroll, the painting in flowing calligraphic style and indigenous watercolor, the central figure in Chinese robes, the garment windswept, bare feet, is a sinicized version of St. Luke's Virgin. Look at Christ, without a halo, but giving the benediction sign, with a shaved head and a topknot of a Ming courtier. The artist adhered so closely to the original while making it a Chinese image. Much of this information about global places made its way to the center of power and shaped early modern state formation in Europe itself. In other words, from the fringes of the Catholic world system, that was a networked operation that flowed information that made localities intervisible to each other, wound up influencing the making of the core of Europe itself. In other words, thinking of a Catholic world system in this pluralistic and decentered way allows us to turn Emanuel Wallerstein on his head. So much of this information would make its way to the center of power, and it would change the way Europeans would see themselves in the world. I have a long description of Samuel de Champlain as a classic emissary of his age. Champlain had cut his teeth serving Henry IV in the clash with the Catholic League over Brittany. He saw the coiling of competition and collusion, which we're going to see becomes really important to the story. Champlain served in the Spanish fleets from Cadiz to the Caribbean and voyaged to the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. We often think of Champlain as the founder of New France. There's a long prelude to this that has to do with the ways in which he enters the Catholic world system. And along the way, he also, and winds up colonizing some of these areas for Europeans. But along the way, he also saw how the English had seized Puerto Rico and used it as a base for contraband and raiding. In every port, he saw vessels loaded with cargoes, docks mounted with sugar and ginger, lined with fruit stalls and pens of African slaves, the thriving tropical nodes of commercial capitalism. Mexico, however, exploded his imaginings of empire and inspired him to pen an eyewitness account for the king, to submit a true report to His Majesty of the particularities which could not be known to any Frenchman, for the reason that they have not free access there. And as he traveled inland, he marveled at the abundance of trees and fruit and cornfields. But all the contentment that I had felt at the sight of things so agreeable was but little in regard of that which I experienced when I beheld that beautiful city of Mexique, when he finally arrives to Mexico City. And from there, he would go on to silver mines, visit cacao and cochineal plantations. And he found some time in his reports back to Paris for medieval flights of fancy about dragons and strange figures with the head of an eagle and wings like those of a bat, the body like a lizard, and has only 2 rather large feet, and on and on and on. Impressions of other Catholic empires, therefore, led Champlain back to the Louvre to become the geographer of the king, which meant imagining the spatial authority of the sovereign in the New World. The Louvre, meanwhile, was being retrofitted for astronomers, cartographers, and navigators, and to warehouse exotic collections. And as the géographe du roi, Champlain would map out the contours of a French territorial empire in the New World. And he would use Cartier's maps to travel up the St. Lawrence, to stitch together an alliance with the rulers of the Algonquin peoples, laboring as an ambassador of one great father to others, which would, of course, have reverberations through this region as well. His New France was an echo of Madrid's New Spain. In response to the alliance between French and Algonquian, the Iroquois went in search of their own ally, finding English also in search of a diplomatic and military partner to buttress New England. And you can see the image on the left-hand side here is one of Champlain's famous arquebus shot into Iroquois forces that were aligned with the English. So it was that the quest for knowledge entangled the world. Catholic agents and agents of Catholicism, it was not always the same thing, played a vital role in this unity. Now, I don't mean to obscure some of the intrinsic tensions between conversion and description, one that often afflicted the Jesuits in particular. Some of this knowledge could get caught up in concerns about idolatry and sectarian texts and information. I'm going to get to an example of that at the very end of the story here. But what's important to signal here is how polycentric the Catholic world system was. In many ways, what happened in Asia, Africa, and the Americas affected and transformed how Europeans saw their place in the world. Catholic knowledge bolstered the consolidation of state systems in Europe and beyond, so that encounters in faraway places made impressions and informed strategies within Eurasian courts, as the reports, like those of Champlain, shaped the calculus of expansion back home. Encounters, negotiations, influences, and responses were transmitted across every link in the chain of empires, from the fringes to central palaces and back again. this was true, these mechanisms produced commensurability between regimes and facilitated the coexistence and conflict, not just in Europe, but between empires in Delhi and Istanbul as well. Even in China, the calculus was shifting, and the Catholic world system had indirect effects on Beijing's foreign policy. The Treaty of Nerchinsk, 1689, with Russia, saw Beijing swap territory to make the Argun River a dividing line to keep Russian settlers out of the Qing territory and cut off the lifeline of support to Mongol borderlanders. That's the Kangxi Emperor there on the right who signed the treaty. This was China's first international treaty. The Tsar then, in turn, freed from having to defend freebooters in the East, could focus on Western ambitions. You can already begin to see the ramping up of the system of rivalry that will cascade into the First and Second World Wars. But in this particular case, mediated by Jesuits, this agreement intensified the partitioning of Inner Asia and helped consolidate Russian Tsardom and Manchu authority simultaneously, and released Chinese armies to squeeze borderlanders into submission or extermination. I have more stories here, but in the interest of time, about Catholic diplomacy in Africa. I'll pass on it. Just to give you a sense of the agency that the church and its agents was playing in seaming the world together. But what does this tell us about what we might call Catholic globalization? Well, first, the entanglement had multiple nodes and hubs, which included the some 400 Jesuit colleges around the world. And if we move beyond a view of Europe as the source of Renaissance and early modern world knowledge, we can see Catholic origin points of world making in many locations and involving non-Europeans simultaneously. Second, it was from the start fueled by rivalries up and down the information supply chains between fledgling powers and Christian devotional divides, and between the multiple reformers of the 16th century. So this fragile unity of Brodel's was fragile and fluid because it was contested within the Christian powers and resisted and appropriated from the conquered of the Americas to the rulers of Asia. The result was a dynamic tension, or a disequilibrium. And here I have to note that I think we are going to have to search for more elastic and, or I might say, dialectical ways to think about interdependence to understand the distempers of our age and the anti-global backlash. But this dynamic tension you can see in the heart of the Catholic world system itself, so that entanglement and exchange fueled more rivalry for souls and silver, and the rivalry pushed agents of empire and spiritual conquest deeper into hinterlands. This reminds us that no system, then or now, is ever as stable as its architects dreamed. I want to end with one more point. It's a long point, but it's one point, because world making required making sense of the world. How did protagonists view their own enterprise as the world merged into one? This Catholic world system coincided with a change, I've already noted this, in communications and media, not just where information went, but how it moved and in what genres. This is a world system associated, as all world systems are, with media. And in this case, the rise of print and the spread of narrative practices. So how did global dealing inform how protagonists viewed their sense of purpose and place? In fact, world makers sought to imagine and represent in order to fashion and to control the world. They aimed to reveal a comprehensive understanding of the wholeness, the abstract totality, to synthesize the fragments into a unity. This was the conceptual and imaginative challenge. Creating narratives was part of the process. In fact, it was part of the creation of world markets. Hence the relationship, why we can rethink the moral market divide that 20th century social scientists have been consumed with. These narratives framed actions, strategies, and policies in stories of peoplehood. They produced what economists would call positive externalities. They make identities more legitimate or illegitimate, which is what we see today, of course, in the backlash. And for the rest of this lecture, I want to explore variations on Catholic narratives of global integration and how they made sense of the world that they were making, how they made faraway places more familiar, akin to how new histories of Protestantism show how missions, like the one that I'm working on about my grandfather, show how missions were world-making in more recent times. Catholic narratives were important for early globalization because they probed not just what humans learned about each other, but the commitments to making strangers familiar to each other. So I propose that we start by bringing the stranger in. This is hard to see. I'm sorry, but that's what the original looks like because of the nature of the paper. Here is a fantasy image. It's an image of an Andean. We know him as Guaman Poma, meeting with his sovereign, Felipe III. But it's an image that never happened. Guaman Poma would author his Great Chronicle as a meeting of strangers, a personal introduction to the ruler of the world. Not as an afterthought to our thinking about global integration and democracy, or as collateral damage in the beneficiaries of diffusion, as you're going to see in a minute. We're going to see how these narratives were central as encounters between strangers. But strangers had been around since biblical times, of course. They gathered in markets and temples. Their interactions as traders were relatively straightforward because codes and rituals for inspecting merchandise were part of the everyday practices of market life. But the pattern changed with long-distance trade and information flows. More intermediation allowed distant connections, entanglements without necessarily bringing strangers anymore into direct contact with each other. So the in earlier days, in the marketplace, strangers would encounter each other, and there were codes of behavior that we know about of these embedded markets. But once you had long-distance trade, strangers were no longer meeting face-to-face. In fact, the paradox of global opening was that many worlds of near strangers yielded to a larger world of distant strangers, hence the importance of the narratives of integration. So early integration yielded stories about ties, of obligation and necessity, about how strangers functioned as both part of systems that Catholic regimes created, but also how the chroniclers had to explain their difference from the strangers and the strangers to us, their otherness, their alienness. How, in a way, distant parts became a screen for the projection of European longings, desires, and loathings. But here we run a risk, there's some danger within our Catholic world system, now that I've converted you all, of imposing a universalism on this idea of unity. This is, in fact, one of the hazards of the global history approach and why you should all be so skeptical of it. Can we make room for the local, the specific, and the plural within this imagined unity? In fact, globalism produces more local histories of the world. So the challenge is how to understand the world as it was imagined as a totality while acknowledging place and perspective. The importance of local voices and visions then got bundled under this Catholic world system. I want to explore a couple of narratives, one in China and the other placed in America, to capture the different perspectives from locations within this Catholic world system. So in China, as I've noted, let me see if I've got my slides worked out here. Yes. So in China, as I've noted, there was a frenzy of knowledge exchange. Note the title page of this work. This is Ricci's. Here he is, dressed as a mandarin, holding the host. Xavier with a nimbus and a fruit-bearing staff. The map is in fact based on the one that I'd showed you earlier on Ricci's, with China at the center of the map as the stage for a Jesuit drama. This book would go through 16 printings in the first couple of years to provide details about spices, geology, markets, popular religion, law, sprinkled with stories about Jesuit achievements, of course. And it would reflect the European Catholic fascination with an exotic, if, and this is important, stagnant kingdom. For all of Ricci's observation and translation, his portrait of China in the world for European readers was one of timeless greatness. His most important work, The Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, published in 1595, brilliantly invoked Confucian texts to explain Christianity. At the same time, he evoked Confucian learned culture as having brought the Middle Kingdom to its highest point in the absence of conversion. The problem was that China's development had plateaued. It had flatlined, more or less on the eve of the Jesuit arrival. So to recapture its momentum upwards, it would have to accept the Lord or face lasting stasis, only to drop out of the pace of apostolic integration. So eyewitnesses, chroniclers, and brokers produced evidence and information that portrayed China as a great timeless kingdom, which, by the time we get to the 18th century, got framed increasingly as one that was decaying and in decline. It was very important for 18th century raconteurs. So that on the eve of the Enlightenment, what the Catholic world system produced was a narrative, a story about China that was becoming seen as a place where nothing had changed. It was caught in what economists would call a high-level equilibrium trap. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend Jürgen Osterhamel's latest book on European stories about China before the Enlightenment. It certainly helped explain why the evangelical enterprise faced so many hurdles. But by contrast, the Americas, so let's flip over to the other side, offered a very different vision and narrative of unity. The Americas created the possibility for a new world unity that neither Asia, and importantly, even Europe, could, because Native Americans proved much more fertile ground for mass conversion. The Americas were the source of a redemptive world history. America, in contrast to China, could redeem Europeans. The condition was the Catholicization of the New World, for which the chroniclers provide an endless parade of evidence and stories. Let's just take one, the case of Antonio Vieira, and I would highly recommend the recent translations of some key sermons by Liam Brockie and Monica Leal da Silva. Vieira, for those of you who don't know, was born in 1608, the son of minor officials, and would join the Society of Jesus in 1623, and would go on to a distinguished career as a writer and a diplomat and a preacher in the Amazon. We're only fairly recently rediscovering his writings, in contrast to Ricci, who, of course, has been iconic. He also made a reputation for himself as a defender of native peoples against the predatory practices of settlers and officials. And for that, of course, he got into hot water often. His prophetic writings remain committed to the idea of an intimate relationship between salvation and empire. His passions appealed to an alternative unity of world souls and the special place reserved for the church to create that unity against the colonizers' zeal to take land and oppress peoples. In 1655, he preached to the Maranhão mission in the Amazon about the urgency of the question. The world itself was on the verge of losing its spiritual unity. Just a few words from Vieira. At this very instant, an infinity of souls is being lost in Africa, an infinity of souls in Asia, and an infinity of souls in America whose help I come to seek, all due to our fault, Europeans' fault, and negligence. Lord Christ, have all these souls not been redeemed with your blood? Lord João IV, Portugal, have all these souls not been redeemed with the blood of Christ? Lord, did you not entrust the conversion of these souls to the kings and to the kingdom of Portugal? His message was that the New World revealed the mysteries of the Old and held out the opportunity to find redemption. For the New World offered an opportunity not just for the rebirth of Christ, but a chance to witness the rebirth of Christianity. In a literal way, Vieira drew a parallel between the three kings and the Portuguese emissaries and positioned himself, one might say, as a New World magi. His was an inclusive, polycentric vision of the Catholic mission. No, he was not like the Peruvians, whom I'm going to end with shortly. He did not see native language, knowledge, history, and culture as a source of global Christian imagery. He did not transpose Christian images onto native ones, though he learned native languages. He did not have an ethnographer's eye. But there was no question about his inclusive urgency. That's the point of the competition. The empire was like a body. It needed fruit to extend its limbs to be healthy. And by reaching into the gardens of the Americas, it could acquire the spiritual strength to convert the world so that all princes and nations will live in peace, and to realize the kingdom and empire of Christ and rescue Europe from its own abyss. In this fashion, we begin to see the origins not just of a world unity, but a recognition of mutual dependency between strangers bound by moral and material ties. I want to drive home this point about a different model of codependency, what we might call globalization, between distant strangers, and the idea of world unity under the mantle of a Catholic world system, and end in Peru. Back to El Inca. I introduced you to him already, the son of a Spanish conqueror and the corregidor of Cusco, and an Inca noblewoman. He was mestizo. He received formal training as a scribe, attended ecclesiastic rites with solemn regularity. He also listened attentively to the deeds of his Andean ancestors from the aging Cusihualpa, who was living in the same house as him. And he would come to lament the lack of writing systems. Already you can see the effect of writing on, we'll see this in a second, to record the heroism and deeds. And in 1563, he changed his name to El Inca Garcilaso to evoke the legend of an older, now buried empire. For him, too, as with Vieira, Europe had an apostolic role. And like Vieira, he worried about the empire burdened by avarice and dreamed of redemption, of a world race. Like him, though, this would be a mestizo race. On the first page of the first chapter of the first volume of his Comentarios Reales, he noted that readers may ask whether there is one world or many, if it is flat or round, and also whether heaven is flat or round. And to this, there's only one answer. There is only one world. And though we speak of the old world and the new world, this is because the latter was lately discovered by us, and not because there are two, but only one. Why? Because God had created all parts of the world. What the Catholic monarchs had done was simply to connect these parts. And off in the colonies, these parts were merging into one, mixing peoples, combining legends, realizing God's universal mission. So integration narratives can often lead us to think of inclusive stories then. The apostles of the Catholic world systems, however, were also concerned with difference and with hierarchy. Guaman-Poma. Conversion allowed Andean peoples to turn stories of dispossession into claims to land and self-rule as elements of a colonial pact and loyalty to a distant king. An example of this art of voice was the effort of the Quechua noble Felipe Guaman-Poma, we've also met him earlier, to have the monarchy restore his customary claims. Guaman-Poma's diatribe against Spanish encomenderos as sinners portrayed Andeans as local Christians, and in his story, conquest was a revelation until the conquistadors turned the Andes into a living hell. His 1615 manuscript got limited circulation compared to the epics written by Europeans and mestizos. Best-selling did remain an exclusive club at that time, as now. Still, it represented the commitment to produce indigenous alternatives to self-serving conqueror epics. In Guaman-Poma's prose case, it was a tale meant, among other things, to vindicate his own struggle to reclaim land and political title in the Chupas Valley, where his family had ruled before the Spanish invasion. As with Vieira, the one he portrayed to his sovereign, was a world of reversals, with the New World positioned as an indispensable, occupying an indispensable place and having an indispensable purpose for a renewed Catholic worldly mission. This image, I'm sorry if it's hard to see, is from Guaman-Poma. The caption to the image is, "The world, the Indies of Peru, are above Spain." But we should also pay attention to what, so he's inverted the world to say that the Indies are not just offer the possibility of redemption, but they're absolutely necessary for the survival of Europe. But we should also pay attention to one often forgotten feature of Guaman-Poma's narrative of Catholic integration. Yes, Christ died for them all, he said, the Moor, the Jew, the black. Christianity was the unifier, but Guaman-Poma never referred to new Christians or to Portuguese, just to Jews and to Moors. Indeed, Guaman-Poma, in contrast to El Inca Garcilaso, was a purist, not a pluralist. Blood and lineage were the basis of his moral order. Pure Spanish, pure Indian, pure black, they were the sons of Adam and Eve, each cast to be ruled by its own nobility. Each one has its dominion in Spain, the Indies, and Guinea. He wanted polycentric integration, but each one pure in its part. Each are legitimate owners, possessors, not by virtue of the king, but by virtue of God and justice, unquote. Guaman-Poma's epic then folds into a wider circulated, competing narrative and sets of images and texts about conquest and colonization, which folded into the political economy of empires vying for possessions and aspirations worldwide. The epic also reflected a concern to explain differences and inequalities in an integrated world. But as Guaman-Poma knew all too well, this opening to the vanquished and the converted should not be pressed too hard. For the Catholic world system also yielded to intolerance and atrocity. Attention, therefore, to how we might think about the ways in which integration created its backlashes. Even as narratives of integration fueled the business of chroniclers, the very integration of strangers kept inquisitors up at night. established late in the 15th century to ferret out threats to piety and national security, the Inquisition went after hidden Jews, Muslims, and fostered vigilance about new Christian near strangers, as well as and other enemies within. What primed it was the flurry of migrations and encounters, trade and finance that we now associate with globalization. So a final example. In Lima, back in Peru, the Inquisition reached a fever pitch in the 1630s, coincident with the escalating wars with the Dutch and tensions within the Spanish and Portuguese, between Spanish and Portuguese within the Catholic world system, which is why I drew the accent earlier on rivalry and competition. Almost 100 people got arrested in what became called the Great Jewish Conspiracy of 1635 to 39 for committing treason and practicing heresy. It led to the trial of 2 men and 1 woman accused of practicing Judaism. Doña Mencia de Luna, Manuel Hernandez, and Manuel Bautista Pérez were charged as Judaizers, as Portuguese New Christians. In the early 17th century, paranoia about crypto-Jews swept the viceroyalty. That says the viceroyalty of Peru. Letters warned of this plague, which so dispersed and spread out, has been thriving in many parts of the viceroyalty as the source of treason all over. Merchants were especially suspect, seen as spies with linkages to Holland, Brazil, and Spain. That they were seen as gifted at money-making made them even more suspect. There was a 1602, that is the same year that Ricci was drafting his most elaborate map of the world that you saw earlier. A royal decree was sent to Peru warning new Christians of the menace, the threat to corrupt recent, the threat of recent converts who may not have the same degree of piety. Local authorities needed to be vigilant so that no error or evil sect is sown among the Indians, who are barely secure in our faith and are vulnerable to any novelty. The real suspicion was about the Jews, masquerading as Portuguese merchants. I can, in the Q&A, if there's time, I can explain why the Portuguese got singled out to be persecuted. But the Hebrew nation was like a weed. It would strangle the new Christianity of Indios and Negros. It was this global linking that was so dangerous because it preyed on the gente simple, the recent converts of the Andes. So as the parts of the Catholic world system got pieced together, religion got racialized. Jews and Muslims who'd been baptized were never cleared of the stain of ancestral heresy. For purists, including Indian purists like Guaman Poma, blood became a code for security. Conversion or declared commitment to faith were not enough. So integration, if this sounds familiar, it should, produced anxiety about the defense, about difference, suspicion about the stranger upon whom empires so depended. Jews linked local infidels to a wider international network of subversives. Many labeled the Portuguese because so many Jews had fled Spain for Portugal, where they converted. And some estimates of the population of Jews in Portugal reached 1/5 of the overall Portuguese population. And after 1497, they were ordered to convert en masse or to leave again, so that a large cohort of them would become new Christians, and many of them would leave for the New World. And a century later, Portuguese and Spanish inquisitors hunted them down. Since so many emigrants were merchants involved in long-distance commerce, and many were Portuguese, they got stereotyped as Judaizers. The convicted faced a dramatic auto de fe judgment. Manuel Bautista Pérez and 10 others were lashed to the stake and burned alive. 52 others got publicly whipped, then exiled. Doña Mencia de Luna and Manuel Hernandez and other charged conspirators would wallow in prison for decades while the inquisitors gathered evidence. What can we say about this Catholic world system? Or, to come back to the title, was Catholicism and early globalization a coincidence, or was there a causal connection? Well, by now, I hope I've convinced you of the latter, that there was a causal relationship between Catholicism and the first globalization. And this has consequences for how we might think about models of globalization more generally. First, to suggest that we think about integration that doesn't depend on old cores and peripheries, that it can be viewed as polycentric with multiple points and hubs held together by a decentralized knowledge circulation arrangement. Secondly, that it had multiple scales. It was a multi-scalar composite regime from parish to central authority, and that this looked a lot like the monarchies that they served. This would challenge the universalism that emphasizes, it also challenges universalism with an emphasis on the transnational, multicultural, and the diverse. In fact, globalism produces local histories of integration. And world-making narratives can be found all over. I've just given you a couple of examples from China and from Peru. And thus the challenge then becomes how to understand how the world was imagined as a totality while still recognizing the particularities of place and perspective. Finally, that the work of the imagination crossed back and forth between the theological and the scientific. Not, as I said earlier, simply flicking from one religious worldview to a modern secular scientific one. In fact, we did not have to wait for the universalisms of the Enlightenment to dream of a worldly universal. In fact, I would say that this imaginary had durable and important consequences for what would come later. So a different genealogy of modernity than the 20th century philosophers like Heidegger, Foucault, and Habermas that would call for epistemological rupture. But rather, the encounter with strangers was the condition for thinking about unity. Yet it was the fragility of this unity that motivated the need for the world-making. And there was a sense of urgency and necessity then, as now, that coursed through this Catholic world system and produced a narrative competition to explain and legitimate a world order before Europeans could see themselves at the center of their own handiwork. The late Christopher Bailey has made the case that modernity was a process of emulation and of borrowing. He has described the ways in which people around the world adopted badges of belief in moving forwards and upwards with the times, without denying that there was something more fueled about the ways in which global print capitalism of the 19th century issued its representational artifacts faster and farther around the planet, especially thanks to the arrival of the telegraphic cable after the 1830s. This lecture suggests that the process had some early and very deep taproots. Unstable and fragile, the first unity wrought by Catholic conquests was no less profound than the later secularizing dynamics of capitalism and later empires. Subduing Native Americans while seeking legitimate authority over them conjoined a political economy of forced labor with practices of empathetic observation and representation. The urge to convert China, to make it the back door to Inner Asia and a new route to Jerusalem, elevated the machinery of inclusion and exclusion to a world scale. Compulsion to work, to sell, to pray, to settle in towns and destroy relics got bound up with a chorus that confronted readers and rulers with the prospect that humans were not just connected to each other. they could represent one, albeit differentiated and unequal, peoples on earth. Thank you.
I'm Tom Causation from the University of Notre Dame. Thanks for that lecture. I hope we get to read it because there's a lot to process there. As you came to your conclusion, I thought of Carl Becker's work on the heavenly city of the 18th century Enlightenment and his argument about a continuity between a Catholic past and a secular Enlightenment of the 18th century that are deeply connected. And that's at the level of ideas. And what you've done is shown us at a kind of ground level a similar process. And I wonder if there is some kind of connection there that you might speculate about.
Yeah. But that's right. I mean, it is an effort to try to lay the foundations for a more continuous narrative. I'll get to some problems with continuism in a minute, but to say that the break between the early modern or what Bailey calls archaic globalization and modern globalization was actually a construction of the moderns, right? To claim that there was a disruption between the two, or a break between the two. The difficulty, of course, is that things do change, right? And I've made the case for the importance of media in particular here, but the politics of the rivalry also changes the dynamics a lot. And of course, many other agents of global integration crowd in. This really still is at this early moment an age in which the Catholic actors dominate the global stage, and they dominate the local production of the artifacts that will produce the intervisibility of the localities. The Protestants will creep in. In fact, the Protestants will consume the Catholic representations, including, for instance, Debris' images, famous images of the Spanish conquest, from other Catholics who, like Las Casas, who will be opposing much of what is happening on the ground in Mexico and elsewhere on apostolic grounds. So how to get continuity while at the same time capturing the contingencies, the changes, the disruptions, the disequilibrium that's at the core of the system, which is what I'm trying to capture here. The danger, of course, with the Catholic world system, and this was what Emanuel Wallerstein's problem, was to over-homogenize this world system, which he laid out as a geography defined by degrees of freedom of labor. Whereas in this case, what I've tried to say is an integrated system through communications. So it's integrated without necessarily a core and with a lot of local co-production of what it is. It's not just about a core producing something out in the periphery. What ultimately what does start to happen on the global scale is, of course, by the 18th century, Europeans begin to narrate an account of their own centrality to the global integration story. Before then, again, if you read Osterhamel's latest book, there's much more of a sense, even in the narratives, of what I've called polycentric integration. Whether that has, the relationship between that shift and Catholicism is something worth thinking about. If you read Osterhamel's book, many of his actors there are Jesuits. By then, of course, it's a relic of its former self in China, but it's something worth thinking about.
Jeremy. Wonderful to hear you again. And it's always a large worldview and always provocative. I was wondering if you could problematize a little bit the presentation of the world order, of the Catholic world order, in terms of the violence and the more dramatic clashes that encounter not just rivalry and competition. I don't think that accounts for the imposition of the Catholic beliefs on the native peoples in great parts of the world. Like Woman Poma talks about a part of the Catholic Church, the Jesuits. He had a interesting connection, long time work experience with them, but blasts things over the other sectors of the church and the local church and things like that. If you could problematize a little bit about that, the imposition of the Catholicism and the violence in the process as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. It's kind of why I ended on the Inquisition. But of course, while there was this tremendous amount of violence being directed against Moors and Jews and suspicious Europeans, of course, there was a great deal more violence being directed against native populations, right? And this is, again, just to go back to one of the contrasts, what's the difference between Asia and the Americas in the narrative, is that Europeans, the agents of the Catholicization of the Catholic conquest could not be violent in Asia for obvious reasons. They were just so outnumbered, and they were there by the grace of the kings who allowed them to preach. That was not the case in the Americas. So a condition for the very redemptive narrative that Vieyra and that Elinka Garcilaso argued for was this degree of violence and imposition, which is why Serge Grzinski has called it a conquest of the imaginary as a condition for the creation of this integrated system. That later on, the mestizo narrative will try to pull out something, a redemptive property to it, but it presupposed a violent conquest. And that's in Garcilaso's own story, right? It's in Guaman Pomas. It's that the conquest was this horrible break, but for those who survived it, it could present an opportunity for them to be the carriers of a new kind of moral purpose for European Catholicism. But it did all rest on the spillage of an enormous amount of blood, destroying many icons and the extirpation of idolatry on a historically unprecedented scale.
We'll take one more question.
Hi, I'm Pete with the Cushwa Center and American Studies here at Notre Dame. And I was wondering if you made a brief comment about seeing the roots of World War I at one point. And so I'm wondering if you might carry this forward into the 20th century. Take us forward in time into things like decolonization, the Second Vatican Council, Second World War. We had a plenary looking at decolonization just a few hours ago. So this was an amazing talk, I thought, for so many reasons. Especially it connected to an early discussion about the importance of the imaginary and the spiritual and theological. It was like maybe a peculiar contribution to this Catholic world system in its own way. But I was wondering if you might just project forward in time. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a more than fair question, and here I have to confess I haven't yet plotted that far forward in the story. I'm kind of making the case here, of course, for an origin narrative about globalization that has to do with the Iberian actors and a Catholic vision of unity that created this, this globalization, what we call globalization. I'm not going to use the word globalization in the story. I prefer interdependency. So it's clear to me what some of the components of the origins of this are. Yes, I did kind of throw out the First World War there with the Treaty of Notchinsk, that we will see the beginnings of the making of a global sort of diplomatic system, and Catholic diplomacy plays an enormously important role in the making of all of this, that is aimed at producing global statecraft dedicated at dissolving tension between rival states. So rivalry and competition is really important to understanding this. Most of our narratives of globalization don't include this, right? We can go on about it, but I think now, particularly in the wake of what's been happening in the past few years, we have to be much more aware of not just the resistances to integration, but the turmoil produced within integration by the integrators competing among themselves inside the system. And that Catholic practices early on, and particularly the role that Jesuits played, and Catholic actors who are not necessarily working on behalf of the church itself, but who self-identified as working for, here we have, I'm sorry, a Catholic mission, like Champlain. This imagery is steeped in the rivalry between the English and the French in the woodlands of North America. So that these alliances and these frictions got started very early on, and got framed by either Catholic actors or actors working on the behalf of Catholic powers was enormously important. We can fast forward to the First World War, and I have in my mind, I'm still trying to debate whether I think the age of the first revolutions, that is the ones that got started in the late 18th century, was really such a determinant in our narrative. I think we tend to break modernity there. I've been doing a lot of reading around the First World War and the lead up to the First World War, and I have a funny feeling that it had to do, 1914 was a more seismic rupture. And the opening of, so I am writing this chapter of what I call the Global Civil War from 1914 to 1945, produced a much more profound epistemic break that had to do with, and you can see it in the paper here, with how we understand the place of strangers in our lives and interdependency between people we will never know or meet. Right? So that is the global condition, right? Is dependency on far strangers and their dependency on us. And what happens in that global civil war produces the first reckoning that, in a way, just to go back to the first question, the conquest of the Americas did not. Right? It didn't produce the same kind of humanitarian rupture that the first half of the 20th century did. Those are just some small.
So before we thank President Adelman again, I believe we start at 8:30 tomorrow morning.
Yes, so breakfast available at 7:30, right in the atrium here, more of a continental breakfast and hot coffee. If you'd like your bacon and eggs or something like that, there is a restaurant in Martin that you're welcome to go to, but we will have food here from 7:30. Panels begin at 8:30. And we did have very high expectations, as John said, for our keynote speaker, and you not only met, but far exceeded them. So yes, thank you very much.